The automatic doors slid open with a mechanical whoosh as a chilly gust of wind swept into the brightly lit supermarket. Outside, the streets were wet from an earlier rain shower, glistening under the streetlights. Inside, the warmth and scent of freshly baked bread welcomed customers, a stark contrast to the biting cold beyond the glass. A woman hesitated just past the entrance, her worn-out coat hanging loosely over her frail frame. Her shoes, scuffed and barely holding together, told a silent story of hardship. She clutched a small, crumpled list in her hand, her fingers trembling slightly not just from the cold, but from something deeper. Behind the register, a young clerk leaned against the counter, tapping his fingers impatiently. The evening rush had ended, leaving only a few stragglers wandering the aisles. He was bored, scrolling through his phone whenever his manager wasn't looking, eager for his shift to end. When he spotted the woman lingering by the entrance, his lips curled into a smirk. He had seen her kind before, people who came in, walked around aimlessly, and left without buying anything. Maybe she'd rummage through the clearance rack or hover near the register, counting pennies. It was always the same. The woman took a slow breath and stepped forward. The linoleum floor squeaked under her damp soles as she made her way past neatly stacked shelves of canned goods and brightly colored snack displays. She moved carefully, as if afraid to disturb anything. The clerk watched as she stopped by the dairy section, picking up a carton of milk before placing it back. She did the same with a loaf of bread, her gaze lingering for a long moment before she set it down and walked away empty-handed. With an amused chuckle, the clerk nudged his coworker. "Watch this," he muttered under his breath, his voice dripping with mockery. He strolled toward the woman, putting on a friendly smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Need help finding something?" he asked, though his tone made it clear he wasn't being sincere. The woman met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I'm just looking," she said softly. He folded his arms, glancing at her clothes, threadbare, old, definitely not the kind of outfit someone who could afford this store would wear. "You sure about that?" he pressed. "Because, we don't do handouts here." A flicker of something crossed her face, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked toward the front of the store. The clerk watched her go, shaking his head with an amused scoff. But then, something happened. As the woman neared the exit, a man in a dark suit entered the store. His polished shoes clicked against the floor, and his presence commanded attention. He walked with purpose, scanning the store until his eyes landed on her. And in that moment, the clerk noticed something strange: the way the man's expression shifted from stern professionalism to something resembling reverence. The woman, who only moments ago seemed so small and insignificant, suddenly stood a little taller. The clerk frowned, his amusement fading. Something about this wasn't right. Who was she? And why did this man, someone who clearly belonged to a different world, look at her like that? The air inside the store felt heavier now, charged with an unspoken tension that the young clerk couldn't quite place. He watched as the well-dressed man closed the distance between himself and the woman, his stride smooth, confident, as though he belonged in places where the rich and powerful made decisions that affected people like her. And yet, there was no disdain in his eyes, only something almost impossible to name. The woman's posture stiffened, and for the briefest moment, she seemed ready to turn and leave. But the man spoke, his voice low yet clear enough to be heard. "It's been a long time," he said. The words hung in the air, their weight pressing down on the moment. The woman's fingers curled slightly, gripping the fabric of her coat as though grounding herself. The clerk narrowed his eyes. There was something familiar about the way this stranger addressed her, something that didn't match the assumptions he had so easily made. Other shoppers had started to take notice, their glances curious but fleeting. No one lingered too long, after all, it was just a conversation between two people, nothing out of the ordinary. And yet, the clerk's gut told him otherwise. The woman finally turned her gaze to the man, her expression unreadable. "I don't know what you mean," she murmured. The man's lips pressed into a thin line. "You don't have to do this," he said softly, though his words carried an intensity that made it clear he wasn't just talking about their current setting. "Come with me. Please." The young clerk scoffed under his breath. This was getting ridiculous. Who did this guy think he was? And why was he acting like this woman who could barely afford a loaf of bread was someone worth pleading with? He cleared his throat and took a step forward, slipping back into the smirking, overconfident attitude he wore like a second skin. "Hey, is there a problem here?" he asked, looking between the two. His voice had an edge of sarcasm, though deep down, unease had started to creep in. The man barely spared him a glance. Instead, he focused on the woman, his expression unreadable. "You're not going to keep running, are you?" The woman inhaled sharply, and for the first time, something flickered across her face, an emotion too complex to be easily named. Fear? Regret? Something else entirely? The clerk shifted uncomfortably, suddenly feeling as if he was intruding on something much bigger than a casual exchange. He had spent his shift laughing at her under his breath, assuming she was just another down on her luck nobody. But now, standing this close, he could see things he had overlooked before. The way she carried herself, despite her worn-out clothes. The way her eyes held something deep, something hidden beneath layers of pain and defiance. And, most unsettling of all, the way the man in the expensive suit looked at her as if she was someone who had once mattered. The woman's lips parted, as though she wanted to speak, but the words never came. Instead, she turned and walked swiftly toward the exit, her worn shoes tapping against the floor with quiet determination. The man exhaled, shaking his head slightly before following after her. For the first time that night, the clerk found himself speechless. His co-worker, who had been silently observing from behind the counter, nudged him. "Dude, what was that?" The clerk didn't answer. Because deep down, he was starting to wonder if he had just laughed at the wrong person. The cold night air hit her like a slap as she stepped outside, but she didn't slow down. The streets, damp from the earlier rain, reflected the glow of the streetlights, casting long, distorted shadows that flickered beneath her hurried footsteps. She kept her head down, shoulders tense, as if she could physically escape the weight pressing on her. But she wasn't fast enough. "Wait." His voice cut through the air, firm yet not demanding. She stopped, not because she wanted to, but because something in his tone made it impossible not to. She turned slowly, eyes guarded, lips pressed together in a tight line. The man in the suit stood a few steps away, his sharp features softened by something unreadable. He didn't move closer, as if sensing she might bolt at any second. For a long moment, they just stood there, the sounds of passing cars and distant conversations filling the space between them. "You don't have to do this," he said again, quieter this time. She let out a breath, shaky and uneven. "Do what?" she asked, but they both knew it wasn't a real question. His jaw tightened. "Pretend. Run. Disappear." At that, something flickered in her expression, an emotion raw and vulnerable before she quickly smothered it. "You don't understand," she said, shaking her head. "You think this is a choice?" He didn't answer right away, his eyes searching hers as if trying to find the truth hidden beneath years of carefully built walls. Then, finally, he spoke. "They're looking for you." Her breath caught. It was barely noticeable, just the faintest hitch, but he saw it. The young store clerk, still standing just inside the glass doors, strained to hear their conversation. He couldn't make out everything, but the tension in the air was thick enough to cut. His fingers tapped restlessly against the register counter, the arrogance from earlier now laced with curiosity and something he didn't want to name, guilt. He had laughed at her, mocked her, assumed things about her. And now, he was starting to realize just how wrong he had been. Outside, she exhaled, steadying herself. "They don't know I'm alive," she whispered. "They do now," the man countered, his voice unreadable. "And they won't stop until they find you." For the first time, fear flashed in her eyes, real and unfiltered. She took a step back, but he held up a hand not to stop her, just to reassure her that he wasn't here to force anything. "I can help you," he said. She laughed, but it was hollow. "Help me?" she repeated. "Do you have any idea what you're offering? What you're stepping into?" His gaze remained steady. "I do." The clerk, still watching from a distance, could feel the shift in the air, the quiet storm building just beneath the surface. He didn't know who this woman was, what she had done, or why someone was looking for her. But for the first time, he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Because something told him that once the truth came out, none of them would be the same. She took another step back, her worn-out shoes skidding slightly against the wet pavement. "I don't need your help," she said, but the waver in her voice betrayed her. The man exhaled slowly. "You don't have a choice anymore." Inside the store, the young clerk watched, his earlier smugness replaced by an unease he couldn't shake. He had expected a simple story, a poor woman, a cruel joke, a moment he would forget by the next shift. But this wasn't simple. This was something else entirely, something that made his skin prickle with the feeling that he was witnessing a moment much bigger than himself. A sudden gust of wind sent a chill down the woman's spine. She knew what came next. The way these things worked, the way people like her were dealt with. She had been careful for so long, burying her past beneath layers of anonymity, scrubbing away every trace of the life she once had. But if they had found her, it meant the past had never truly let go. Her gaze darted toward the street, toward the moving cars, the blinking lights, the open road. A fleeting thought run. But before she could act, something shifted in the man's posture. He wasn't just here to warn her. He wasn't here to drag her back, either. No, there was something else in his expression, something closer to urgency. "They're already here," he said. And then she heard it, the sound of an engine idling too long at the curb, the almost imperceptible shuffle of feet from somewhere beyond the dimly lit street. The woman's breath caught. She wasn't just being watched. She was being surrounded. For a split second, everything froze. The world held its breath. And then the first shadow moved. The man in the suit lunged forward just as a figure emerged from the darkness, their movements sharp, deliberate. A glint of something, a weapon? Flashed under the streetlights. The woman barely had time to react before the man grabbed her wrist and pulled her toward him, shielding her. "Go!" he ordered, and for once, she didn't argue. She ran. Her legs burned, her heart pounded, but she ran. Behind her, she heard the scuffle, the sound of bodies colliding, the unmistakable grunt of pain. The man who had come for her, the man in the suit, was fighting, buying her time. The store clerk, still frozen in place, felt his stomach twist. He should have looked away. He should have stepped back inside, pretended he never saw anything. But something inside him screamed that this was wrong. And then, without thinking, he moved. He bolted from behind the counter and out into the night, his sneakers slapping against the pavement. He didn't know what he was doing. He wasn't a hero. He was just a guy who had laughed at a woman because he thought she was beneath him. But now, seeing the terror in her eyes, the desperation in her steps, he knew he had been wrong about her. She wasn't just some poor woman. She was someone worth chasing. The woman barely registered his presence until he caught up to her, panting. "This way," he gasped, grabbing her arm and pulling her down a narrow alley. She hesitated. Who was this kid? The same one who had mocked her minutes ago? But something in his face made her trust him, even for a second. They sprinted, dodging trash cans, slipping past darkened doorways. Behind them, the sound of footsteps pounded against the pavement. The people after her weren't giving up. But then silence. She stopped, chest heaving. The store clerk turned, confused. Did we lose them? The woman's stomach dropped. No. This was wrong. It was too easy. And then, before she could warn him, a hand clamped over her mouth, pulling her backward into the shadows. The clerk's eyes widened. Hey! Something struck him hard across the face, sending him sprawling onto the ground. He tasted blood. He scrambled to his feet, but by the time he did, she was gone. Vanished. Just like that. The street was empty. The only sign that she had ever been there was the faint echo of retreating footsteps, the whisper of a life slipping away once more. The store clerk stood there, dazed, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He had spent the entire night thinking she was nobody. But now, watching the empty space where she had just been, he realized something that chilled him to his core. Whoever she was, she had always been somebody. And someone out there had just taken her back.